I'd like to welcome Vidhya, Alakeson and Rachel Perkins. Vidhya is Deputy Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, an independent policy and research organisation that aims to improve the living standards of low and middle income people. She's led the national learning set for the pilots of the personal health budgets for mental health. She previously worked for 3.5 years for the US Department of Health and Human Services on behavioural health. Before that, in the UK, she was a senior policy advisor for HM Treasury at the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, working on policy for children, young people and families. And she's also worked for leading think tanks, including the Social Market Foundation and Policy Network. Rachel Perkins is a freelance consultant and chair of Equality 2025, a non-departmental public body that offers strategic confidential advice to the government on issues affecting disabled people. She spent more than 30 years working to enable people with long-standing and severe mental health conditions live independently and take part fully in society. She is and has been involved in far too many activities for me to go through them. I'll just mention that formerly she was Director of Quality Assurance and User Experience at South West London and St George's NHS Mental Health Trust, is a clinical psychologist and herself a user of mental health services. In 2010, she was voted Mind Champion of the Year.
Well, shall we get started then? I mean, I suppose I was going to start, was I? That's
yes,
right. That's right. I mean, I guess one of the things that 33 years now working in the mental health arena and using mental health services as well has persuaded me is that actually we badly need a change in the approach we have. At the moment, in mental health services, we've typically seen mental health conditions as a clinical challenge. So we've argued about what people's diagnoses are and what sort of treatments, and I'm not just talking about drugs. I started life as a clinical psychologist. I went feral, but so I guess my thing was doing psychologically bits. But I suppose we've typically seen mental health problems as diagnosis and treatment. Our aim is cure, but if we can't do that, while we're doing that, we care for people and contain them if they're a bit of a nuisance. And so I guess for me, recovery approaches and personalisation actually mean that we've got to view mental health conditions as a social and personal challenge, not just a clinical challenge. And that actually recognise that to be diagnosed with a mental health condition is actually a devastating and life-changing event in our society. And often the biggest barriers that people face have nothing to do with symptoms. They actually have to do with what mental health problems mean in our society. And I guess ideas about recovery, like a lot of the history of personalisation and direct payments, actually didn't come from learned professionals, awfully sorry. They actually were born of people who actually themselves had faced the challenge of rebuilding lives with a diagnosis of mental health problems. I think if you look at ideas about recovery, they go back to the American Civil Rights movement and the work of people like Judy Chamberlain. Has anyone read On Our Own? Wonderful book, isn't it? I reread it recently. It's still just as relevant today. Sorry, Judy Chamberlain did a load of work about how actually people with mental health conditions didn't actually need to look to services and experts. That the challenge was for us to actually find our own solutions. But she did a lot of that early work around recovery. And I guess when I talk about recovery, what I'm talking about is actually often a search for meaning. Search for meaning in what's happened, search for a new sense of self, purpose, discovering and using your own resources and the resources available to you, and growing beyond what's happened to you. When I worked in rehab services, we did a lot of maintenance. I don't do maintenance anymore. My view is we grow until we die, and some of you might believe it goes on after that as well. That's not my issue. And I guess it's that process of rebuilding a satisfying, hopeful and contributing life. Obviously, people like are there any psychologists in the room? Oh, I can be rude about us then. This is where you have to actually beware of psychologists, because psychologists are really good at inventing formulas and stages for things. Psychologists, we did it with bereavement. Then we did it with addictions, didn't we? I get lost, pre-contemplative and I don't know, I got lost. They've also done it with recovery. And I guess what saved us was the social anthropologists who found that people didn't obey the stages. There really isn't some sort of grand formula for recovery, but it does appear that three things are particularly important. Hope, believing that a decent life is possible. We all work in these gloriously hope-inspiring services, don't we, like East London and City, where the first three signs you get to are no violence towards staff, you'll be prosecuted, we're not responsible for your possessions and report to the office. No? That's what I'm describing South West London there. These lovely hope-inspiring places. I suppose the second thing is actually taking control over your life. Mental health services and professions, we're very good at taking over control. I think actually the process of recovery is about taking back control over your life, your destiny, the challenges you face, and of course the help you receive. And then the chance to do the things you want to do, participate as an equal citizen. Now these have an obvious fit with personalisation, but not quite such an obvious fit with traditional mental health services. Because I think we've got to be absolutely clear, I'm talking about recovering a life, not recovering from an illness. So I'm not talking about cure, I'm not talking about theory about the causes of mental health problems. I don't really care whether you think mental health problems were caused by strange neurotransmitters, the weird things that me and my kind have invented, you know, id, egos, superegos and dysfunctional cognitions, the evils wrought upon you by a vicious world or the action of various deities. It really doesn't matter what you think caused your problems, you still face the challenge of actually rebuilding your life. And I suppose most importantly, it's not actually a professional intervention. I guess a recovery approach and personalisation really do require a fundamental change in the culture and approach and balance of power within our health services. I think there's actually three elements to that. First is a redefinition of why we're here, the purpose of services. This may sound a little bit abstruse, but I still see the most money in services going into eliminating problems, deficits and dysfunctions rather than rebuilding lives. I guess it also, I think, requires a change in the balance of power between professionals and the services and professionals and services and the people they serve. I've often, some of you will have heard me use the phrase, professionals should be on tap and not on top. It's what Churchill said of scientists. We need their expertise, but for God's sake, don't let them run the country. I think the same applies. You know, professionals may have expertise that we need, but for God's sake, don't let them run our lives. I think it's really about actually changing what we do, not fixing people, but supporting self-management, completely different approaches to risk and such like. And finally, I think it's about actually creating inclusive communities that can accommodate all of us. The right to participate in every aspect of life. Is this happening? Well, if you look around, the word recovery is all over the shop, isn't it? You can't open any mental health thing without seeing recovery. Me and my mate Julie Repper are thinking of changing it to discovery. But as soon as you do that, it'll just be the same thing. It'll be all over. And we've all seen, everyone's got recovery indicators and recovery strategies and recovery training and peer support workers and all these kinds of things. But I think there are also signs that in the hands of rather powerful professionals and services, some of the ideas about recovery are getting a bit taken over and distorted. It's kind of being translated into health terms and something that services do. So frequently you hear, yes, recovery is all very well, but my clients can't recover. It really does suggest to me that actually recovery still becomes getting better in some way, ceasing to be dependent on services. And I also have a little bit of a worry when I see things like recovery workers being employed. And then we have the signs, have you seen the signs changing? We've stopped having community mental health teams and all that, and they've suddenly become recovery teams. And then of course we've got recovery interventions, and people talk to me about the recovery model. I guess one of the sort of lines alongside, we've got medical models, psychological models, social models and recovery models. You take your pick. I guess one of the challenges I think we face is if these ideas are going to really change what we do, then we really do have to look at how we stop taking them over and making them into something we can all deal with. I think the balance of power hasn't really changed very much. We still believe that professionals know best. We're very good at involving people and going along with what they want, providing they agree with us. If people don't agree with us, when we spend a great deal of trying to persuade them of the error of their ways. Lovely paper written in the States some years ago that actually looked at compulsion and force in mental health services. And they weren't just talking about sort of seclusion and restraint and all that lot. They asked people if they'd ever experienced force. And most people said they had. But for most, it was what they called it verbal persuasion. I think we could call it bullying in more common. But we're very good at actually trying to persuade people that we really did know best. And I suppose we've got to, I think, be very, very worried that the ultimate use of power, compulsory detention, is increasing. It's gone completely mad in this country. We had this idea that CTOs, community treatment orders, were going to stop us admitting people. There were going to be 400 to 600. Do you remember, Anna? There were going to be 400 to 600 of them, and they were going to reduce inpatient admission. They haven't. Inpatient admissions increased, and we keep doing CTOs. If you look, we've got 4,220 at the last count. And actually, even the guy who was really in favour of them to start off with wrote a big article and was all over the front page of, what was it? Was it the Telegraph Times, saying they don't work. Even the Lancet said we've got to give them up. But really, compulsory detention, that whole force, has increased. At the same time as we're talking about rights and self-determination, we're locking people up. And I think we've got to really think about what we're doing there, which we'll come back to. But over to you.
Okay. So, personalisation. I think Rachel sort of ended her first section, she'll be back, talking about power. And although the Department of Health doesn't talk about personal health budgets or personalisation in these terms, at the root of it, it is about a transfer of power. And what makes them, I think, a game changer, if we implement them in the right way, is that they really are about transferring power to individuals and giving individuals a new, sort of a really new dimension on the kind of control that they have over the sorts of services that they use and how those services are delivered. But I wanted to sort of pause initially before talking in a bit more detail about personal health budgets and how they are and can be a tool for recovery, to sort of say, for those of you working in services, I think what a lot of people kind of get overwhelmed by and fed up with is this kind of the new initiative that comes down from government. So, you've just got on top of recovery and built that into your services in a good or bad way, depending, and suddenly the government's telling you that you should now be doing personalisation, and then it's a whole sort of, well, okay, what is that? But I think one of the things I really want to emphasise is that in philosophically and in essence, recovery and personalisation are basically the same thing. They're the concept that came out of, in the context of personalisation, came out of the independent living movement. People were released from institutions, moved into the community, but found they were still largely living in kind of segregated, ghettoised service lands with very little access to wider community, sort of limited relationships with people outside of services. And the movement around direct payments and people taking control of their own services was about getting a life, not just getting a bunch of services. And recovery and personalisation in that sense are about using services to support you to regain a life rather than being sort of driven and dominated by those services. So if you take nothing else away on personalisation, it's really important to sort of remember that these two things are basically moving in the same direction. So a personal health budget, as I said, this is a new kind of initiative that's been going now for about 3 years. Really important tool if we use them right to sort of speed up recovery within the NHS. So what are they? They're basically, in a nutshell, at essence, NHS resources that would otherwise be spent on your care, used by you in a different way to deliver a different package of care according to what you think, together with your clinician, might work best for you. So it's not about private money. I'll come on to that bit. It's not about private money. it's very clear that it's not always appropriate. So nobody's talking about personal health budgets for a hip operation. Nobody's talking about personal health budgets at A&E. You know, when you're nobody's saying that crisis and unplanned care won't be available. You know, we still anticipate that some people will get ill at various times, and therefore there'll need to be some sort of system in place. But this is about your ongoing care. It has no relationship to, at least in the NHS context, no relationship to your own income. It's public money. And in the context of the NHS, sort of in some ways in contrast to social care, it's partly about shifting the balance of power, as Rachel sort of described, between individuals and clinicians, rather than getting rid of clinical expertise entirely. So it's a way, I suppose, of making the clinician on tap rather than on top actually a reality. So the Department of Health has defined 5 features of a personal health budget. These, I think we should sort of interpret these relatively loosely, because I think you can get quite hung up on whether you're satisfying these 5 features and that becomes the be-all and end-all of what you're trying to do. But this is the sort of experience that's come out of the 3-year pilot programme. So essentially what happened in 2009 was the pilot programme was started. Pretty much every PCT in the country got involved because there was money on the table and there were some brownie points to be got by getting involved. Quite a lot of them did nothing very useful, if I'm honest, and probably about maybe 20 working across a range of conditions did some really interesting things, and about 5, I'd say, in mental health have done some really interesting work. And so that's sort of all now been digested, and this is what the department sort of says a personal health budget should really be about. So it's about your health and well-being rather than a narrow focus on clinical care and clinical outcomes. That an individual should know how much money is in their personal health budget in order to develop a plan about what they want to do with that money. So it's been a real challenge in the pilot programme to clinical professionals to have a conversation with individuals about money. I don't know how many of you are clinicians, but it's not a conversation that happens in the normal day-to-day running of the NHS. You know, actually it's involved some people having to have conversations about whether an individual thinks that their service, their OT service that they provide, is actually worth spending £250 a session on. So it's definitely been difficult for some people to have that conversation. But ideally, you as an individual, if you're a personal health budget holder, know how much is in your budget, and you can plan your care around that. You're enabled to create your own plan. So, you know, there's lots of care planning initiatives, but the idea here is that the individual drives that care planning process. They can bring in other people to support them. They can bring in expertise from a range of other people, but they are at the heart driving that process. So rather than, essentially what happens in a lot of care planning processes, you know what services are available, somebody comes in and before you've really talked to them very much, you're fitting them into the boxes of the services you know you have. This is meant to be the individual at the heart of it driving the process. And there are various different ways in which the money can be held and the individual can choose how that's done. So direct payments that some of you will know about, where you receive the cash into your own bank account, is only one option, and that shouldn't be the only option. If you don't want to manage the money, I personally am not sure I'd want to do all of the paperwork associated with managing the money. You can have somebody manage it on your behalf, so you can have the choice and the control without the paperwork if that's what you choose. And regardless of how you choose to hold the money, whether you hold it yourself or somebody does that on your behalf, you should be able to spend it in ways that you choose. And there are very limited restrictions on how the money should be spent. So there are some certain NHS services that are off the table. So GP services, prescription medication, public health, things like immunisation, emergency services. I mean, they're provided for by the NHS and would not be included in the personal health budget. Beyond that, you can't buy alcohol, you can't buy illegal drugs, you can't buy cigarettes, and you can't pay off debts, and you can't gamble, which is legal, but you still can't do it. But everything else is within the realms of possibility. And one of the things that the evaluation has found, which was a controlled evaluation that ran for the length of the pilot programme, one of the things that they found was that the more flexible the personal health budget is, so the fewer restrictions, the better the outcomes. So what they found was that actually people, particularly people who live with a long-term condition and the evaluation covered a range of conditions, not just mental health. They get pretty expert at knowing what might work for them. And actually, if you try to restrict that and create menus that they have to choose from, you actually start to limit the effectiveness of the intervention. So, we live in a world of evidence-based medicine, so the national evaluation and its positive findings has counted for quite a lot. It basically found that people who had a personal health budget, and this was across conditions, had better quality of life and better psychological well-being than people who had care as usual. It was more cost-effective. There was a reduction in inpatient use, and none of the things that people often worry about with sort of these choice-based mechanisms, as policy sort of likes to define them, that they will disadvantage lower-income people, they will disadvantage people with less education. None of those things were found. So there were no differences in outcomes by any of those kind of socioeconomic factors. And what was particularly sort of interesting from a mental health perspective is that of the conditions that were included in the evaluation, which were things like COPD and diabetes and stroke and a lot of physical health conditions, the outcomes for mental health were particularly positive. So you can see that one of two ways. I was slightly disappointed that there wasn't a more emphatic policy prescription around the rollout of personal health budgets for mental health, because I think the evaluation justified a much stronger push for mental health rollout, but equally nothing is off the table. So the two obligations on the NHS at the moment are one that starts in 2014, which is that everybody eligible for continuing healthcare, which is the sort of high-end, long-term, people with very long-term complicated healthcare needs who are entirely NHS funded, they have the right to ask for a personal health budget starting in April 2014. So every clinical commissioning group that now is in charge is expected to be able to deliver a request for a personal health budget in some fashion, somehow, within a year. And then there's a less defined obligation around 2015 where CCGs are expected to be able to offer personal health budgets to anyone with any long-term condition who might benefit from one. So it's a bit weasel wordy, if you ask me. It gives you a little bit too much wiggle room to not offer one, but that's where mental health would kind of come in. So what did people actually do? I'm going to just give you a few examples, and then Rachel's going to sort of talk about another possibility after I've finished. So there was quite a lot of use of what came to be called a recovery budget, which was essentially a small amount of money that was given to people who were in various different kinds of services. So some of it was in early intervention teams, others were people in community mental health teams. They were small top-up budgets that was intended to kind of accelerate somebody's recovery. So it might have just been about £500, a one-off payment that people used to buy things like bikes, computers, anything that they did a small sort of planning process around it, anything that they felt would support their recovery. Whilst I think there was a lot of good outcomes that came out of that approach, in a very cash-strapped system, I think the issue with recovery budgets is there is no underspend anymore. It's very hard to know how to find new money to add to people's services. And so I think, fundamentally, they don't change the underlying system. They're sort of a wrapper around the top. So whilst I think they are an easy place to start and they have had some good outcomes, I think they're sort of limited in what you can really do with them in the long term. There was quite a lot of interesting work around personal health budgets for dementia, which a lot of the people with dementia were coming through the continuing healthcare route, so quite big packages of care, hundreds of thousands often, but very successfully maintaining people with dementia who were told that they would never live at home, maintaining them at home, living with their family, with quite sophisticated care packages, lots of use of people employing teams of personal assistants in their home. An interesting pilot in Kent around IAPs, so psychological therapies, where individuals were given a personal health budget instead of a traditional course of CBT with an NHS provider. And one of the most interesting things I thought about this pilot was that almost everybody who took a personal health budget instead of a course of CBT at the NHS Trust went out to the private sector and bought some kind of talking therapy. They didn't necessarily use all their money for talk therapy. They They did other things around the side. And when you talk to them about what they'd got out of that going out to the private sector, what they basically said was the private sector allowed them to, say, have shorter visits each time, but more visits over, to spread out the visits over a longer period of time. They were allowed to email their therapist in advance to see if they actually could strike up a rapport, or whether they would actually prefer to work with somebody else. They could change the times. So nothing very sophisticated, but even that small level of innovation wasn't on offer at the NHS Trust. And when Rachel and I did a session with some trusts around personal health budgets, and when I said to them, so, I sort of described what had happened at Kent, and they all turned around and said, well, we could do that. And I sort of said, but none of you have. There's no way of receiving a psychological therapy service in an NHS Trust that has any of even those small, which are really only consumer service responses that you would see in any private sector market. And it's not because it's public versus private, it's because there is no pressure on trusts to really do that kind of innovation. But when given the ability to go somewhere else, that was really what people were after. A pilot in Southampton around alcohol detox, so this was kind of a very clinical service where people were allowed to choose different ways apart from an inpatient detox, which was the only thing initially on offer. They used their personal health budget to actually create quite a lot of alternative services in that area. The Commissioner's working very closely with personal health budget holders to make that happen. And then some pilots in community mental health. And I just wanted to... I stupidly didn't print this out, so I'm going to have to read it off my phone. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an example. So this was from the Northamptonshire pilot, and this is a guy called Alex, who I've interviewed a couple of times. And I just wanted to read to you what he said about his personal health budget, and I'll do a condensed version because this is quite long. So he says, I had a stroke in October 2009 and a mini stroke last year, which left me blind in one eye. Following this, I was being helped for my physical problems, but was struggling to get help for my mental problems. It was then I heard that NEN Commissioning was looking for suitable candidates from different areas of Northamptonshire for the personal health budget pilot project. I was asked to put together a health plan, which my occupational therapist helped me with. I had to establish and outline my needs and then price up services. And so he goes on to say, I received everything that I said I needed in my plan, including a PA. I lived alone and my PA helps to support me in terms of mobility and memory problems. It also covered the cost of a sat-nav and a tablet. The latter has helped me restore my IT skills. As a result, my confidence in technology has increased, and I'm now able to use my home PC and new smartphone as helpful tools to overcome or adapt to some of my disabilities. I use the personal health budget for private counselling on a weekly basis, and he goes on to talk about some of the other things he's bought. But at the end he says, I've been humbled by the people I've met on my personal health budget journey, and it's made a huge difference to my life. I think that rolling it out across the country would be a fantastic idea. It's a win-win for the government, it's cost effective and enables people to be directly involved in trying to improve their own health, lives and well-being. And having been a weekly user of the CMHT, Alex has now been discharged from services. And the real thing that made a difference to him was going from being a person who had no real motivation in life after his stroke and the loss of his own identity that came with that, to being somebody who was able to help other people. So he became very involved in various support groups. And the sat-nav and other things that he'd bought with his personal health budget allowed him to drive other people around. It allowed him to kind of become go from somebody who needed help to somebody who was able to really fulfill that for other people, and suddenly he regained a whole kind of purpose in life. And for those who sort of, when you actually read what he spent his money on, a sat-nav, a computer, a drum kit and various other things, it doesn't sound very much like money that the NHS should be spending, or things that the NHS would traditionally be spending money on, let's say. So I just wanted to show you the sort of a brief snapshot of what the costs have been in the pilot from Northamptonshire. So the table at the top is the control group, and that's their spending sort of the year before the pilot and the first year of the pilot. So the top group basically spent a bit more in the second year, but not a huge amount in it. And these are all people who use some kind of acute inpatient service or crisis service. And then the bottom table are the people that were in the pilot who were also users of people who'd used acute inpatient or crisis services. I mean, there the difference is dramatic, and I haven't just cherry-picked the numbers to make it look dramatic. They actually found really substantial savings, particularly for those people who were high-end users. It seemed as if the approach to were giving them control to decide how they could keep well, stay well, and move on in their lives really did have quite a transformative effect, both on their own sort of outcomes and well-being, but also on the amount of services that they used. So I think there's huge opportunities to use personal health budgets to reorient the system towards recovery, and part of that is using them as a more preventative early intervention kind of approach to mental health services, rather than the generally crisis-driven approach that we have. And it's interesting that the evaluation did find across all the conditions that inpatient use was reduced. I think one thing that Rachel's going to talk about is how they can be used to reduce compulsory detention, so used in the crisis situation alongside joint crisis plans, and we'll talk about that. And there's obviously there's now a formal statement of commitment by the Royal College of Psychiatry and ADAS, the Association of Adult Social Care Directors, to try and put personal health budgets and personal budgets together. And I don't know if people heard the announcement from Norman Lamb this morning about joint teams across health and social care. It sort of made me, weep, or somewhere close to weep, because I feel like the only way in which we're really ever going to successfully deliver integration is not by creating new joint structures that are forcing people to work together, but by starting at the individual level, kind of trying to bring the resources together around one individual across health and social care. And that's you.
Sorry. Just before I move on to this, I'd just like to say that I suppose we've talked a lot about personal health budgets at a commissioning level. One of the things the last thing I did in the NHS was get one of those. Tony Blair had some adults facing chronic exclusion team, basically homeless people who didn't fit into anyone's box and had got chucked out of mental health because they weren't mad enough, and learning disability services because they weren't learning disabled stuff, to fall through everyone's nets. And one of the things we decided to do in that team was have one less member of staff and £1,000 personal budget for each person who came to use that team. When I first suggested that, I was nearly lynched. We can't manage with less staff. Then, being a director 2 years later, I had to come and say, well, actually, we're going to cut that budget now. And I was nearly lynched again, because you can't possibly work without this £1,000. It was what we needed. And it just enabled you to do those boring little things, like put someone up in a B&B, like pay their electric bill so that they got connected again. So actually get them a mobile phone so you could find them a sleeping bag, and a decent sleeping bag if they were sleeping out. I mean, it was incredible how useful that was. And again, that was at the secondary provider end, which I think is really what I'm thinking about here, because I suppose I am really concerned about the level of compulsory detention we're getting to in this country. And I suppose if we look around at the evidence base, there is only really one bit of evidence base for reducing that. Particularly now we've got CTOs. The way it used to be was reducing beds, because then you had a finite pot, but now we've got a slightly larger pot, because you can have CTOs for anyone. I suppose the real evidence base actually comes from some work that was done by Claire Henderson and her colleagues at the Maudsley, where what they did was actually developed joint crisis plans for people. Now, this involved an independent person. It was a bit like ACAS, the Advice, Conciliation and Arbitration Service, someone to actually make sure that the team and the person arrived at an agreement about what would happen if they got into crisis again. And what they did in that, they reduced the amount of overall admission, but they also halved the rate of compulsory detention in the following things. There was a slight problem with this, and if anyone was working on acute wards at the moment, you'll know it to be the case that actually, even with joint crisis plans, the range of options are fairly limited. It tends to be you can either get an acute admission or you can have the home treatment team. But as the home treatment team can only see you if you would otherwise have been admitted, actually, as one person said in the Mind inquiry, you have to literally have 1 foot off the bridge before anyone will take you seriously. And it does get a bit catch-22-ish, doesn't it, at times? If you're able to say, I'm in a really bad place, can you help me? Then you can't possibly be bad enough to need crisis care. I'm only being slightly cynical there, and I don't think it's anyone's fault, but I think that's just where we've got to in terms of crisis care. I guess if personal health budgets were available in conjunction with joint crisis plans, it seems to me that one could actually be in the position of those joint crisis plans operating earlier in a person's journey in a crisis. That if you were really able, I've got a friend who, she had a budget and she goes to a retreat in Middle Piccadilly. She has 12 days a year in a retreat in Middle Piccadilly whenever she wants them. Instead, she was one of those people who came in and out of hospitals. When she said Middle Piccadilly, I thought, why the hell do you want to go on a retreat in Piccadilly? It's not, it's in Dorset. And they do all sorts of things. But actually, that is hugely cheaper. And she never actually spends all her 12 days. Because she always keeps a few banked up just in case. And has not been admitted since. Now, we know lots of little examples, don't we, of people who have used that. And I think we've got to do a little bit of systematic work, thinking, how could we systematically look at those people who are repeatedly compulsorily detained and say, is there a better way? One of my hats, I'm the chair of the Ministerial Working Group on Equalities in Mental Health. And one of the things I was particularly concerned about was looking at how you could use personal budgets to promote equalities. And together with one of Vidhya's co-conspirators, Kevin Lewis, we actually, with some various other people, developed a proposal that, well, the Department of Health said, yes, it's lovely. And we said, what are you going to do? Don't ask the Department of Health to do anything these days. What they say is, we can't do anything. There's the NHS Commissioning Board and there's clinical commissioning groups. I have actually been tempted to ask them, well, when are they going to abolish you? Because I really can't think. But I guess one of the things we're looking at is whether it's possible to get someone to just have a little pilot of, if you're closing a ward, keep a couple of 100,000 behind and actually use that to target those people who are repeat, what you call frequent flyers, revolving door, and look at whether there is another way of doing it. Because actually, if you did have a bit of money, going to stay in, I think, people go and stay in the most awful places, don't they? A bed and breakfast at Wall's End. Now, I don't mean to be rude, but would you go to a bed and breakfast at Wall's? I can think of lots of better places. I guess, as someone I know who actually has someone to go and stay with her all day, when she's having a bad way, just go and be with her at home, helping her to do things, helping her to sort things out. All sorts of other crisis services, relatives, friends. How could we actually think about early in that journey into crisis? I'm looking at you, Alan, here, you see, it's your next bit of research. Nobble someone to give you a small amount of money and target those repeat inners. So it's not looking at the soft end. I say that's what we've been trying to persuade people to be interested in. Although I do think that ultimately we've got to actually look at a much more human rights perspective and a rights-based perspective on this whole issue. I'll come to that in a minute, but just in relation to the Mental Health Act, the Mental Health Act is intrinsically discriminatory. Are you all familiar with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? Have you heard of it? It covers people with mental health problems, and the UK signed it. And it does actually entitle you to all sorts of rights. And actually the High Commission on Human Rights has said that our Mental Health Act is illegal. So have various psychiatrists in this country. Don't worry, look at George Schmuckler's work. I mean, I think we've got to actually start thinking. I think it does push us, the whole personalisation bit, to move beyond some of the rather restrictive things that we've been doing that may contravene various international obligations we've made. As you'll be doing challenges.
Right. So, coming back a bit to personal health budgets, the biggest challenge, I think, start again. I think the biggest challenge is probably the bottom of the slide, the cultural change, in actually getting both individuals and professionals to work in completely different ways and to share power is, as I was reminded 2 weeks ago when I did a session at SLAM for the consultant psychiatrists, we've got a long way to go. They basically were quite disinterested, I think, to put it politely. But
been recording.
Yeah, that's why I'm being polite. But I think there are some other pretty practical challenges that really are quite big as well. And the first is actually how do we get resources out of existing services to enable other kinds of choices to be possible. And in mental health, I mean, the largest blocks of money are still in beds, they're still in large block-based services. And actually, I can't give you a personal health budget to make your own choices if I can't take some of that money out of existing services and start using the money in different ways. And whilst it sounds quite simple, actually getting the system to re-engineer itself to allow personal health budgets to happen is going to be a real challenge. And we know from social care, from personal budgets to social care, that when you don't do that bit right, what you get, which is what we've got in a lot of local authorities, is people who have personal budgets in name, but actually they're still stuck within the commissioned services that already exist. So the local authority has got a block contract with 3 providers, and with your personal budget in social care, you can choose provider A, B or C. Well, if you want provider D or E, or you want something completely different, you've got no option. So, that is a huge kind of organisational challenge for the NHS as a whole. Other things, I think, the personal health budgets, despite my best intentions, are still kind of, minor sport in the NHS, and there are a lot of big trains kind of carrying on regardless. So things like payment by results, things like any qualified provider, and there's a job to do to integrate personal health budgets into some of those bigger engines that have much more drive and much more power behind them. And I think there are tensions. A lot of people are very nervous about riding on the payment by results train, the sense that, a payment currency that's based on clinical diagnoses, what has that got to do with personal health budgets that's based on a social model? The two are very much in tension, but my sense is that if we try and create an alternative infrastructure around personal health budgets, we're just going to die in the weeds as things like payment by results move forward. Obviously, pilot sites had money to do a lot of this. There is no new money coming to support the rollout of this, so trusts, commissioning organisations are going to have to find money from within, anticipate savings in the future potentially, but this is going to have to be funded from within existing activity. And then finally, bureaucracy. The system just loves creating it. So you talk to most mental health professionals about personal budgets and social care, and they basically roll their eyes and just say, that is just one bureaucratic mess. I don't really want to have to work with it at all anymore. And people have just backed away from the whole concept of personalisation because they think, because their experience tells them, that personalisation equals bureaucracy. Actually, personalisation has nothing to do with bureaucracy. We just choose to set it up in those ways. And one example really sticks in my mind. I was doing some work up in Manchester, and this wasn't mental health, but it might as well, it's all the same in this context. There was a guy who'd had a trampolining accident. He was 27. He'd been paralysed from the neck downwards. He was coming home after 9 months in rehab, and he had a £200,000 continuing healthcare package. And they had a panel of 5 senior people deciding whether the tablet computer, they had already approved the fact that he was going to have a tablet computer to be able to communicate better with his extended network of people who he wasn't going to be able to see as much given he was now paralysed. But they spent about 3 days debating whether they were going to pay the extra £200 out of a £200,000 package so that he could have an iPad rather than a different kind of tablet. And they made the poor kind of broker who was involved in putting the package together put forward loads of different cost estimates for different types of tablets, and basically they'd spent more than £200 in the staff time that had taken them with these 5 senior directors of whatever it was making these decisions, and nobody had the presence of mind to step back and go, this is ridiculous, this is £200 of spending for her £200,000 package, this is completely disproportionate, and we've created an enormous bureaucratic monster. And there is a real opportunity as personal health budgets roll out to try and not repeat some of those mistakes around personal budgets, and to try and keep this lean, keep decision making as close to the front line as possible. If you set quite clear rules about what you can buy, what you can't buy at a local level, and then allow clinical professionals, people at the front line, to make decisions about what's allowed and what's not allowed, there's no need for all these panel processes that everybody has started to create in the pilot programme.
But I think actually that bit about culture change becomes the kind of key issue, and we're going to have to do a bit of a culture change. You do all know about the parity of esteem stuff, don't you? Come across parity of esteem? It's something in the mental health strategy, and we've got to have the same sort of esteem as physical health services. And one of the things they're doing with that at the moment, and I think it's as of April 2014, is saying just like if I go to my doctor and I've got, I don't know, I had something wrong with one of my salivary glands, I can decide which place I want to get referred to. They're going to do the same with mental health. For anyone getting referred new to mental health service, you can choose where you want to be referred. And not just that, but you can choose which team you get referred to. This is going to set cats amongst an awful lot of pigeons, if you think about it. Lovely responsibility on the non-statutory sector for providing people with the information they need to make informed choices. But these are actually going to happen. But I think actually recovery and personalisation require a really different model for understanding the challenges. To put it crudely, if you want someone to be included, do the things they want to do, you've got choices. You can either change the person so they fit in, or you can change the world so it can accommodate people. I know that sounds a little bit crude, but if you think about it, most of what we do in mental health services is changing people so they fit in. So we decide to get rid of their symptoms. They look at skills. Any OTs here? We look for skills deficits and then give people skills training. The whole aim is to help people to change so that they fit in. Actually, if we look at what the broader disability world does, well, they treated that guy, but he was still paralysed. Recognise that? We treated them, but people still face challenges in our services. So actually what we did then was say how you can create a world that can accommodate him. So that tablet was actually part of, if he's going to communicate with people, he needs another way of doing it because he can't pop next door. And I guess what I think we've done too little in mental health services is think about how we can create a world that can accommodate people with mental health conditions. And again, learning from the broader disability movement, I think what we need to do is to replace that overarching clinical framework with a model predicated on human rights and a social model. And I guess if we think about some of the work that's been done in the broader disability world, I know there's probably some academics here who know all about this much better. My brief reading of Mike Oliver. I mean, I suppose what it's actually saying is that, in fact, we can talk about what's wrong with people, but it's not that actually disables people. It's the fact that people are in a world that has all sorts of barriers that actually mean you're excluded. So you're not disabled by having a broken spine, you're disabled by stairs. So we look at how you can actually create a world that's accessible. I guess actually if we look at the history of the mental health service movement, I don't know whether any of you are familiar with the work of Pat Deegan. Have you read her 1992 paper where she talks explicitly about how it's really important to look at what we can learn from the broader disability movement. Because as she says, having a psychiatric disability is for many of us simply a given. The real problems exist in the form of barriers in the environment that prevent us from living, working and learning in environments of our choice. The task is to confront and challenge those barriers, not to continually try and change people so they fit in. And I guess actually a human rights approach and a social model has actually enabled the broader disability movement to make some really quite enormous steps forward. You know, it wasn't that long ago, in the Second World War, Roosevelt, he was never ever shown a picture of him in his wheelchair. Nobody ever knew he was disabled whilst he was the President of the United States. He had heavies on either side of him, holding him up, and that was always assumed to be his guards. There wasn't actually a statue put up of him in his wheelchair until 1990s. There's one in Washington, D.C. now. And I guess if you think about how far we've moved in that physical arena, I have a friend who used to work for KPMG, and he has a 24-hour personal assistant living in his home. It's a rota of them. They don't make them work 24 hours, they have shifts. That he employs on a direct payment, and he can't get up by himself, he can't feed himself, he can't go to the toilet himself, so he has to have someone with him all the time. I just want to meet the person with a mental health condition who has a 24-hour personal assistant living in their home. And I'd like to ask you how many people living in all sorts of sheltered, segregated accommodation could actually be at home if that was made available. Because I know certainly you could empty out most of the ones that I had in my service. And I suppose I just think we've got to get real about this. This has been happening for another group of people. And it's the legislation that underpins that. There's the UK Equality Act, there's the Independent Living Strategy that you were talking about, just in the midst of developing a disability strategy, fulfilling potential. I've got to go to a meeting at 4 o'clock to further deal with that. And of course there's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Disabled People. These are all things that actually people with mental health conditions have access to. Yet if you do a little survey of the people you work with, how many of them actually know what their rights are within those bits of legislation? I think it's probably fairly few, unless you're wonderful in East London City in the way we weren't in South West London. You're probably much more up to speed. But I guess the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People actually does talk about the right to live independently and be included in the community. And I guess in mental health services, what we've often thought about independence is not needing services, being discharged, isn't it? Independent means not needing us. Actually, in the broad disability world, that is not what it means. It actually means having all the support and help you need and control over that support in order to do the things you want to do and live the life you want to lead. And I think that really is turning a lot of our traditional things upside down. How many times are we actually required to make people so they don't need support and discharge and get rid of them? That's our aim. Actually, that's not the aim. The critical question within all this rights legislation is actually what a person can do with that support and how much control they have over that support. That's what matters in recovery. That's exactly what personalisation is about. And I suppose a social model of disability actually makes us ask different questions, doesn't it? It makes us ask not what's wrong with the person. And I know you all do strengths-based care planning, but I'd like you just to go and get one set of notes out when you get back to your team and count up how much of the writing in there is about strengths, possibilities and assets, and how much is about deficits, dysfunctions and problems. Because I've yet to find the one that made 50-50. We really are obsessed with what is wrong with people. And I'm afraid I have to say that extends across to be in Australia, the NGO sector, the non-statutory sector as well. I suppose what we have to ask a different question is, what are the barriers that are stopping this person doing things? And how do we get around these barriers? So what is the mental health equivalent of the wheelchair? Why not personal assistants, PAs, that's what, for people with mental health conditions? What is the mental health equivalent of the hearing loop? I'm not being funny here. There's great volumes. If there are any OTs here, you know, they have these great books of aids and adaptations for people with physical impairments. I've never seen the one for people with mental health conditions because we haven't actually started thinking about it. What is it that people are going to need to get round those barriers that they face? And I think, finally, it gives us a different way of thinking about independent living. Our government defines independent living as all disabled people, remember that includes people with mental health conditions, having the same choice and freedom as any other citizen, at home, at work, and as members of their community. This doesn't necessarily mean people doing things for themselves, but it does mean that any practical assistance people need should be based on their own choices and aspirations. And I suppose for me, at the bottom line, that is what both recovery and personalisation are all about. I think I'll probably shut up there. You're all fed up now, aren't you? You knew it all. You knew it all.
Thank you very much.